Hello and welcome to the Monday Night Wars. It is September 4th, 1995. We are at the Mall of America in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I am joined by my podcast co-host, Joseph Rojas. Hey, Joseph, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Scott. How about yourself?
I can't complain. I'm excited to do the inaugural run here of our podcast on the inaugural night of Monday Night Nitro. Kind of an important date. It was strategic. It was a strategic date. It was the night that Raw was being preempted by the U.S. Open. So
Yeah, and there's a popular theory on that it was the Westminster Dog, was it kennel or club?
Westminster Dog Show, I think they called it.
Dog show. Thank you. Yeah, there's a popular theory on that. That's not true. If you just look up the date, that happens in like February of this year. It is the U.S. Tennis Open. It was a popular thing for USA to do. I don't know if I'd say popular, but it was a common thing for them to do, where if they had like a live event that was really important, they knew it was going to bring in a ton of viewers, they would actually move Raw either back to a different day or they would just cancel them because they were already pre-recorded and they could just move them to the following week anyways.
So let's start with the fact that it was at the Mall of America, which is different, right? I mean, obviously this is not an arena, but this was kind of part of Bischoff's plan. I mean, go ahead and give your thoughts, and then I'll chime in.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting strategy just in general. It gives a unique feel that you don't have really in WWF at the time, and really for a long time after this. I can't think of. I know I've watched the first few years of this kind of war. And I can't think of a time where they're really in a place that's as unique as this. And WCW is going to do this a lot, not just with Mall of America, but a number of other unique venues.
Yeah, and Eric Bischoff talked about this. I was listening to him on 83 Weeks, which if folks like podcasting and enjoy this podcast, you'll probably like that podcast too. But he talks about why they did the Mall of America, and obviously the big thing was that it was a place where a lot of people would come and go every day. So they knew that they would have folks that would show up, because at this point WCW is having some attendance problems, or at least they were. They were having trouble selling tickets, because for a long time they had done house shows all over the country for free. And so people had kind of gotten used to WCW being free. Eric Bischoff talks about them devaluing their product. So when you actually tried to offer people tickets, they were like, nah, I'll just wait till it comes around again for free. So this was a free show. It was available to anyone who was wandering the mall. And it's also a pretty kind of tight space, which also allows the ability to look like it's a really packed house, even if it's only a couple hundred people.
Yeah, I think to your point on the making it look like a packed house because of how small it is, it looks stunning on the screen. It is a great visual. Every time I watch the episode, my first thought is, this is one of the coolest things you can see in wrestling.
Yeah, I think it was great. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of it. So we start off. We have the intro where we introduce our commentary table, and we've got Eric Bischoff, we've got Bobby Heenan, we've got Steve McMichael. Just for folks who don't know, I'll give kind of a brief overview of each of them. Eric Bischoff, who we've already mentioned, he was the executive producer and later became the senior vice president of World Championship Wrestling. He replaced Tony Schiavone, who had previously led commentary for WCW's other programs on the inaugural night of Nitro. Bobby the Brain Heenan was known for his wit and his comedic timing as a villainous wrestler and manager to other wrestlers. He was to be WCW's heel commentator. He had been doing commentary for the company since 1994 and had provided commentary for WWF since 1984. And Steve Mongo McMichael, an American professional football player, he was added in hopes of creating interest in WCW with the football watching audience. He was meant to be the face. And beyond that, I think really the only real interesting thing about this is kind of the setup of McMichael shakes Bobby the Brain's hand, and he has a hand buzzer that he's holding in his hand, and shocks Heenan. And this is, I guess, supposed to start off the rivalry between the heel and the face commentator. What'd you think about that, Joseph?
I think it's hard to put into words because it's such a small segment, right? I mean, really, they're just trying to say, hey, we've got this new show, and here's our lineup on the commentary table. It is kind of an interesting coup because Steve Mongo McMichael had actually kind of worked with WWF a few months prior to this. during the whole Lawrence Taylor versus Bam Bam Bigelow storyline, they end up having a number of other professional football players kind of in his corner. And one of the main ones is Steve Mongo McMichael. And he gets actually a ton of screen time in comparison to the others. He's a natural, charismatic performer. I think we're going to see throughout the night that he actually speaks pretty decently on the mic. Sometimes he gets a little flustered, but I think that's probably nerves of it being his first time. But he knows to at least project himself in a way that can kind of get people kind of hyped for what's going on. So WWF actually at the time was attempting to sign him. According to Bruce Pritchard on his podcast, Something to Wrestle with himself and Conrad Thompson, he says it's not a big deal that he moved on. He says they weren't like super hell-bent on trying to sign him, but I do think having an established Super Bowl winner who is very well known by America really in your corner is a huge deal. I mean, whether you're WWF or WCW. So for at least from that standpoint, I think it's fine. Obviously, there's gonna be more that happens with Steve McMichael later on. Some highs, some lows, but as far as how it applies to this particular episode, seeing a big name like that, I think is really good, especially pairing him with someone like Bobby the Brain Heenan, where Bobby the Brain Heenan is going to give 100% every single time he's on the mic. Overall, I give this kind of segment like a C on kind of an A to F scale. It's not great, but it's not bad. It's just doing the job that it needs to do.
All right, so first match, Juice and Thunder Liger versus Flying Brian. He's going by Flying Brian at this point, although it is Brian Pillman. Juice and Thunder Liger is a Japanese professional wrestling legend, mixed martial artist, wrestled, I think, pretty much his entire career with New Japan Pro Wrestling. He won the IWGP Junior Heavyweight Championship numerous times. Just real big name in Japan. Flying Brian Pillman, obviously a former football player. He turned wrestler. He's worked for WCW since 1989. He had previously been part of a stable called the Hollywood Blondes, the fourth version of that stable, with a wrestler by the name of Stunning Steve Austin, who we will probably never hear from again. And I'll give the outcome of the match, and then we can maybe go more into depth with the match. But Flying Brian defeats Juice and Thunder Liger via roll up. The match is about 6 minutes. What do you think about this match, Joseph?
Honestly, I'm surprised it was 6 minutes. It felt like way longer. Overall, it's a fun match. I mean, you have two of the most talented and gifted in-ring performers in the history of wrestling, both in their primes. Obviously, we know what's going to happen with Brian Pillman later on. We'll just kind of get there. I'm not going to go too far into that. And Juice and Thunder Liger would wrestle for many, many years after this. And at this point in their careers, they're both fantastic. There's a number of impressive spots, a cartwheel kick into the corner. Brian Pillman does a head scissor takedown. Juice and Thunder Liger does Mexican surfboard, which I love. I don't know if that's what it's called anymore, but that's what it was called back then, especially when you played the old SmackDown games. It was always a Mexican surfboard. There's just a lot of great spots of two athletic wrestlers who really know how to put on a great show in the middle of the ring. And there's a moment during that where Bobby the Brain and Mongo McMichael actually kind of get a little bit tied up in their commentary. It's fine. Again, it's the first episode. They're trying to figure it out as they go. Brian Pillman wins with a reverse roll up, and overall, I'd give the match an A. How about you, Scott?
I also think it's a great match. I also think it's a great match, not necessarily just for the in-ring ability, which is second to none, I think, but also just kind of the juxtaposition of it versus what you're seeing on WWF. The story, the lore, the way Eric Bischoff tells it is that he kind of one day just kind of secluded himself and just went and sat down with a pen and pad and just started writing all the things that WWF did and how he was going to be different. They taped, we're going to be live. They do squash matches for their stars. We're going to have just like really intricate technical matches, all this kind of stuff, and just so on and so on and so forth. And this kind of match is just exhibit A of what you're not really seeing on WWF. And I think to start with it is kind of a shot across the bow of this is different. This is going to be different. And I think that that's really important. And I thought it was a great move to put this match first and put two great guys in this match to start it off.
How do you feel about the fact that you have, as this first match, you have someone that WCW fans know really well with Flying Brian Pillman, and someone who, though he has probably worked in WCW at this point, they did have a semi-working relationship with New Japan that had kind of gotten unhealthy prior to Eric Bischoff. But you have Jushin Thunder Liger that really, if you're, Joe Schmo turning your channel, you're not going to know who this person is if you just happen to go on to Nitro.
That's true. It certainly doesn't necessarily have the names. I think people are probably familiar with Flying Brian at this point, Brian Pillman. Maybe not so much, Jushin Thunder Liger, but as you are right, they did have a relationship. Maybe not necessarily the best name wise card, but I think certainly if you're watching, and and once again, this is a night where they're unopposed, so you can't flip over and see what the other people are doing. You're here to watch. And there's not that draw of some other card that you're competing with. So I think that this was a smart move. That even though it wasn't the biggest names, the fact that they're running unopposed tonight, they can take a risk like that of having a great match like this with guys that they know will win you over that may not be the biggest names of the night.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point too, with them being unopposed. The fact that you don't have certain wrestlers who are going to be coming in who really take the audience's breath away from their in-ring abilities, specifically from athleticism levels, and we'll be getting there very soon. These two guys put on a banger match to start off.
Agreed. All right, so let's move on then. So in between the first and second match, we have two promos. We have a promo that Sting cuts that was, I'm not sure if it was recorded. It's not. It doesn't appear live. It's somewhere else. But it's a promo that he cuts on Flair to get us hyped for their match, which is going to come up next. He talks about it. Really seems like they're kind of portraying this as the new versus the old. Sting talks about how he does a Scorpion Deathlock better than anybody and that sort of thing. Overall, thought it was a good promo. I think it's a typical Sting promo. Do you have any thoughts on it?
I literally only have one thought. I've got it written down here in my notes, and it's Surfer Sting equals ratings. That's it.
Simple and true. I thought it was a perfectly fine promo. But here comes the promo the next promo is the promo we're going to want to talk about. This is the famous Hulk Hogan promo cut on Big Bubba Rogers at Pasta Mania, brother. I actually have one note, but obviously I remember it very well. It's kind of stained in my mind. But the one note I wrote down is peak Hogan. I'm gonna pass it to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a weird one. On the one hand, I kind of understand the negative feedback that it gets. On the other hand, this is 1995 and WCW is trying to find their way. And this is obviously a marketing play. I kind of like it. Honestly, I'm surprised by how much I like it. It's absolutely Hulk Hogan going as ham as possible. It's ridiculous and over the top. And every time I watch this, I kind of go, man, I want to try Pasta Mania. I don't know why. That's really all I've got. Overall, if I were to rate this segment, and I think it's long enough to rate it, I'd give this a B.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to try Pasta Mania because I think the place only existed about a year longer. Eric Bischoff has talked about this, and he said that it wasn't really a WCW thing. It was an existing relationship that Hogan had. They happened to have one location, and it happened to be in the Mall of America. So it just kind of the stars aligned, and Hogan wanted to do this promo at Pasta Mania because it's his branded pasta establishment. I think you're right. We have to remember that it's 1995. I don't think this is particularly unusual product placement for the time, and I personally think it's hilarious. It's peak Hulkamania. It's just completely on brand for Hogan. It's peak Hogan. I really enjoyed it. I'm with you. I think it's a B. It's a little cringe. Not going to give it an A, but I think it's a B. I don't really think it's the worst thing ever that people portray it as.
Yeah, I think if we were to say it's an A, absolutely we'd be madmen. But I think just overall, it's, to your point, it's hilarious. The visual with all the kids, like they're all just there, like they got to get their pasta and they got to see Hulk Hogan. Is that ever going to happen? Probably not. But again, 95, and WCW will get known for really creating a realism in wrestling, as well as companies like ECW, and then later on, a lot of the stuff that's going to happen in WWF. We're not there yet, so we're going to still have that kind of that bend of reality.
Yeah, and honestly, one of the best lines of the night, that he's going to have pasta mania running through his brain, brother. I laughed out loud. It was fantastic. All right,
That's great.
let's move on. Let's move on to the second match, which I'm sure we're going to want to talk a lot about because it's two of the greatest wrestlers of all time going at it again and again and again, but they're great every time. Ric Flair versus Sting. Two men that don't really need an introduction, but I'm kind of running on the premise that I used to be a journalist, and every time I wrote a story, my editor told me that I had to act like no one had ever heard of anything I was talking about before. So I'm just going to quickly give you the rundown of who these two guys are. You probably don't need it, but I'm going to do it anyways. So Ric Flair, a 16 to 25 time world champion. Apparently there's some debate about how many times he actually won. WWE says he won 16 times. He says he's won 21 times. Other places have it 25 times. I don't know. 16 to 25 time world champion. He was the first to hold the WCW World Heavyweight Championship and the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship, and the first person to complete WCW's Triple Crown, having also won the WCW United States Heavyweight Championship and the WCW World Tag Team Championships. Sting, he comes to be known as the franchise of WCW. He's kind of their big homegrown talent, their guy. He ends up being a 15-time WCW champion with more pay-per-view appearances than any other WCW wrestler. He's also at this time commanding a salary of $750,000 annually. It's a lot of money for the time. It's a figure that becomes known as Sting money because he's so highly paid. You'll probably hear us talking about that later in the program about how it's not Sting money or whatever. It was a lot of money, and it just showed how important he was to the franchise, and he was kind of the franchise of WCW. Let's talk about the match, and then why don't we get into kind of the big reveal during the match? You want to talk about the match first, though?
Yeah, I think this might be a good place to kind of actually just take a real quick sidebar and talk about how you and I kind of rate matches. Overall, a match really needs to have, I would say, what, 3 things? What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And one of them is how is this progressing the story? The second one is in-ring action. And the third one is really entertainment level. In-ring action is, your Bret Harts, people like that, where you're going to get a very safe, crisp, clean match every single time. This guy's going to do work that nobody else can do. Overall entertainment could be a comedy. It could be, later on, people like Santino Marella or the Hurricane. It could be somebody who just keeps you, laughing the whole time. It could be something that's entertaining on a level of overall action or athleticism. But I think the main one is, how does this impact the story? So for that reason, I'm actually going to negatively react to this match just a little bit, not a lot. Overall, you have 2 of the greatest wrestlers of all time. On top of that, when you talk about people who are in rivalries, you touched on it before, Sting and Ric Flair repeatedly go at it. Well before this, well after this, after this company's long gone, moving into things like TNA, they will repeatedly go after it. And honestly, it somehow never gets old. It's something that is so fun to watch every single time. It's almost like you can see the respect level these two guys have in the ring. The thing I don't like about this match more than anything is that it kind of ends in a DQ that does nothing for Sting. It doesn't press a storyline for him. It's going to result in, I think, Arn Anderson interferes in this match.
Yeah,
and that's
Arn Anderson runs in. We don't know who he's running in against. Turns out he's running in against Ric Flair. We get the DQ. It's meant to set up a rivalry between those two, but yeah, it kind of does nothing for Sting.
Yeah, and so from that standpoint, overall, I'd give us a B. But that's only because I'm not overly fond of the DQ finish. I think you could have done just as much with a clean win and then Arn Anderson coming out. In fact, I think it would have been more interesting if Sting went over Flair and then Arn came in and started their rivalry, especially because you have Flair coming off a loss. But overall, I mean, it's two of the best and two guys who love to work with each other, and I think you can see it on screen. What about you?
So the official stat line is that Sting maintains the US title versus Ric Flair. It ends in a no contest. And the match lasts about 8 minutes and 43 seconds. I agree with you. The Arn run-in, I thought it was, it's fine. Obviously, that it's there to create a story. I mean, they are using it to create a story. They're using it to create a story between Arn and Flair, though, not Sting. Because I kind of felt like we had a story with Flair and Sting. They were kind of building that up as the new versus the old and all that kind of stuff. And and as you know, and people who listen to this podcast will learn, I love new versus old matches. I think it's one of the simplest, but one of the greatest kind of gimmicks in wrestling. So I'm kind of sad that they just kind of dropped it for the Horsemen feuding, I guess. It does lead to an absolute fire promo from Ric Flair next week, which we'll get into. So maybe it's all worth it in the end. But yeah, the match was a little disappointing. But obviously, the purpose of the match probably wasn't even that. The purpose of the match was to introduce Lex Luger, right? Lex Luger makes an appearance as the bell rings for this match. It was an absolute coup for WCW. Just to give you some background, obviously, Lex Luger, he's an American professional wrestler. He's a bodybuilder. He's a former football player. He had wrestled for Jim Crockett Promotions and WCW from 87 to 92. He was a 5-time NWA WCW United States heavyweight champion. He holds the record for consecutive days and total days as a champion for that. He was also the second WCW Triple Crown champion. He moved to WWF where he wrestled for the company until a day before the first Nitro. Luger, whose contract had expired 6 months prior, was working on what I heard Eric Bischoff describe as a handshake deal with Vince McMahon. Sting, who happened to be a good friend of Luger's, found out that Luger was wrestling without a contract. He reached out to Bischoff, pitched Bischoff on the idea of bringing Luger over. The funny thing is, Bischoff didn't really want to hire Luger. On the 83 Weeks podcast that I mentioned, to sum it up, Eric Bischoff described him as an arrogant prick. He said that was his reputation at the time. It probably explains why he had a gimmick called the narcissist. That was probably not that far from the truth at the time. Obviously, people, he say what you will about him then now. Eric Bischoff says very nice things about him now. He's found religion. He's become a very, very peaceful and kind person. I'm not arguing that. At the time, though, he had a reputation of being an arrogant prick.
He had a history in WCW prior to this. That reputation was still sticking around in WWF. When he shows up, according to Bruce Pritchard on his podcast, Something to Wrestle With, he talks about the fact that himself and Pat Patterson were actually kind of celebrating, not, throwing their hands up, but just relieved. Thank God we don't have to deal with him anymore.
Yeah, and you mentioned that he not only had that in WCW, he had in WWF. To go back to his first foray in WCW, he had an item in his contract where he was only required to work a specific number of days. And after he fulfilled that, he essentially sat out the entire end of 1991 and the beginning of 92. He wrestled 2 matches in that time. And Bischoff didn't really want him, but he liked Sting. Sting was the franchise, so he felt like he had to do something. So he lowballed Luger. He offered Luger a $150,000 a year contract, which was about $350,000 less than he had been making in WWF. Bischoff assumed he would say no, and Bischoff could go back to Sting and say, "Well, sorry, but I tried." But Luger said yes, and he came over on the condition that he could not tell Vince or anyone else that he was leaving WWF. He flew in on a separate plane. He stayed at a separate hotel. They didn't move him to the venue until a couple of minutes before the match. I mean, to put this into perspective, this was 8 days after he appeared at SummerSlam and only one night after competing at a WWF house show. And he shows up at the inaugural episode of WCW. What a coup.
Yeah, I think it's huge. In general, he is a big name. He's somebody that they really pushed in WWF. You know, he's got a great look. He's, you know, got some problem on the mic, but overall, he's somebody they pushed regularly, and they actually had a whole storyline with him at the time. They had him and Davey Boy Smith, aka the British Bulldog, those two wrestling together. They had just had a moment where they were splitting apart, and they're going to run down that and kind of create a rivalry between them, with Luger staying as the face and British Bulldog becoming the heel. And then all of a sudden, you know, they don't have a show this week, and they all turn it on, and there he is. And that whole storyline is gone, and they got to do rewrites and figure out how they're going to move on from it. They actually were supposed to have him in the video package for the new fall season that WWF is advertising at this time that'll happen the following week, and they couldn't put him in that either.
Yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely wild. But at the time, you know, he shows up, he walks down the ramp, although it's not really a ramp, but we don't know why he's there. Doesn't say anything. Eric Bischoff screaming to get the camera off of him, get him out of here. He leaves. We don't know why he's here, but we're gonna find out. We're gonna find out later. But in the meantime, after the end of the Sting Ric Flair match, we have another confrontation. This time, Scott Norton confronts Eric Bischoff at ringside, saying that he signed a contract and he wants a match. Steve McMichael steps in, and you're thinking that maybe this is the setup for these two, for McMichael to wrestle Scott Norton. But then in runs the Macho Man Randy Savage, who interferes against Norton, and we sign a match for next week on Nitro. Obviously, this features the Macho Man Randy Savage, who is one of your all-time favorites. So why don't you tell me how you felt about this promo?
As far as the promo goes, overall, I would give it a B. But you're right. I love Macho Man. I also love Scott Norton. You know that about me, and he's going to have a direction pretty soon. He's not there yet. I love. We've talked about it pretty regularly. Overall, he's one of the most underrated performers in the history of wrestling, to me at least. Obviously, you could probably argue it, but I like that they go, look, we're going to bring you in. We're going to put you up with one of the biggest names in wrestling history, with Macho Man Randy Savage. I mean, there isn't a phrase he can't turn. There isn't a match that he has, at least up until this point, that really is, you know, him underperforming or not trying. So I think it's great from that standpoint. I think that they're saying, we're going to give you an opportunity to kind of shine. It may or may not kind of result in that, but it's a great visual. I mean, if you're tuning in to, you know, the first episode of Nitro, and you really are someone who's lapsed as a fan, you know that they've got Hulk Hogan and you know they've got Macho Man Randy Savage. You want to see those guys. And they do that. They do it really simply. They throw it in immediately. It's not a long promo, which I like. It kind of gets the point across. Macho Man at this point is very unhinged, is the best way I would describe him. He's not really, you know, cold and calculated. He's just kind of running wild. And I absolutely love that version of Macho Man. I think 95 through 96 Macho Man is probably my favorite era of Macho Man.
In this one, Macho Man clearly steals the show. Just by being Macho Man, he's my favorite part of it. I really love when he says, "Let's have the match right now," and then goes in the ring and like throws himself onto the mat in kind of this reclining position. It's just so good. I agree with you though. B. I don't think it's not the greatest promo I've ever seen, but it's fun, and everyone does their part. And Macho Man plays it in spades. But yeah, I thought it was pretty good. Moving on, we have, after that we have a vignette. It's a Sabu hype video. It's got a weird filter on it, but overall I think it's fine. You have any thoughts on the hype video?
Honestly, the only thing I can think of is that when I watched this for the first time, I was surprised to see it. I was surprised to see Sabu in at this point. He just doesn't seem like a WCW guy. I don't think he's there very long. it doesn't do anything for me, but it's really just to tell you this guy's coming, and that's the only job it needs to do. So it does that fine.
Following that, we have Mean Gene naming the winner of the Harley Davidson sweepstakes. We have a Saturday night promo, and we have a Fall Brawl promo. Nothing, I don't think anything really there to talk about, just that they happened. Just giving folks the flow of the show. The next promo, though, was probably supposed to be a bigger deal than it became, because Lex Luger coming out kind of stole the show. But we have Mr. Michael Wall Street, Mike Rotunda, cutting a promo, and it's essentially making fun of WWF. It's clearly mocking his IRS, Erwin R. Shyster persona from WWF. I think that was supposed to be the big get, but then they got Luger.
I really love this first episode of Nitro in general. This segment I hate with a passion. I think just making him Mr. Wall Street is just so on the nose. It's so just lazy. I mean, you had an opportunity for someone who could clearly play a character, and you just went, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're really not going to try. I hate some of the lines that are happening here. A lot of this episode of Nitro, the things I really would take away from it, and we may talk about this a little later, but are the digs they're taking at WWF. And they do it a lot. And he does it quite a few times in this promo. He calls the new generation the few generation, which isn't even that great of a line. But it's making fun of the fact that WWF at the time was the new generation, all their new wrestlers like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. He says the IRS will probably be watching him close. That's a dig at his former gimmick, which made him money. So it's weird that he would make that dig. I would give this an F overall. There's nothing about this promo that I like.
I will give you a little factoid, though, which I found interesting doing research on this. He actually used this character before. When he was in WCW, Jim Crockett Promotions, in the mid-90s, he went by Michael Wall Street. And his valet was Alexandra York, who people probably know better as Terry Runnels. And the whole gimmick was that they were like stockbrokers, and they were using their computer to figure out how to win matches and how to win matches and how long it was going to take to win matches. I think it was kind of a play off, Wall Street, the movie, or those sorts of things. So this is actually not copying IRS. And in fact, IRS may have been copying that. It's kind of the chicken and egg thing here. I don't know, but you're right. Overall, I don't care what came first. It's not good. I didn't like it. In hindsight, I think they're probably very fortunate that Luger came out, because if this was their big get, it was not great.
Yeah, I think the character's kind of dead in the water the minute that he debuts, and that's unfortunate, because I have nothing against Mike Rotunda or anything like that. I just think that they probably could have done better. It's also, when you think about it, the third person they have debuting on this episode, and it's easily the worst out of all three. And they kind of start high with Luger, they go a little lower with Scott Norton, and then by the time you get here, it's just not impressive anymore.
And I think they thought it was a big get, and it doesn't work. So they were saved by Luger on that one. For the third match, this is our main event. We got Big Bubba Rogers versus Hulk Hogan for the WCW Championship. Hulk Hogan, I doubt needs an introduction, but I'll do it anyways. I mean, he was the face of WWF in the 1980s boom. He left wrestling in 1993 to attempt, and I say attempt, a film career, but returned in 1994 and signed a contract with WCW. I think particularly important to that is that in Hogan's agreement, it contained language that gave him complete creative control over his character. And as you can imagine, he quickly became the WCW World Heavyweight Champion. And that part of the contract I'm sure we will talk about a lot over the course of this podcast, because it becomes very apparent, his creative control, as we move on. Big Bubba Rogers was more famously known as the Big Boss Man during his stint in WWF from 1988 to 93. He joined WCW that same year, going by the Boss, until WWF threatened legal action, and they forced him to change his name to Big Bubba Rogers. Just as a point of note that I noticed while watching this match is that two kids in the front had Hogan sucks and Hogan is a wimp signs. that were taken by security. They were pretty upset about that. I just found that very interesting because that kind of goes to, are these kind of the waning days of Hulkamania? And then because there's a story in the Nitro book that I previously mentioned where during the press conference for this first Nitro, Hogan hit them with one of his normal lines. What are you going to do when Hulkamania runs through you or something like that? And just got no response, to the point where he panically said it again to muted applause. I just found that very interesting. Hogan goes on to win this match because, of course, he did, and he retains the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. It's a 7-minute 8-second match, and let's talk about it. What do you think?
Well, I think the fact that it's a longer match than Jushin Thunder Liger versus Flying Brian Pillman just proves that Hogan's a workhorse, man. People got to stop saying he isn't. I don't know. I'm kind of torn. I had made my notes on this and I had graded it positively. I'm going to stick to that, but there is some stuff that I thought was interesting that you kind of mentioned there. When you talk about Hogan in this era, if you have not been watching, since the, late 80s, kind of early 90s, and you see Hogan, there's some stuff that I think is kind of trapped in that era. Hogan in the trunks, I think, is boring. Interestingly enough, he's got an updated bandana and he's got an updated shirt, and I love those. I think they pop. I think they're very cool, even though they're the red and yellow. But the trunks kill me. I mean, they're just boring to look at. And I think when you see that, there is a kind of juxtaposition of what he's trying to do. He is kind of, in the river without a paddle, and he is just floating. He has no clue how to kind of get out of this. As far as the match goes itself, I think it does a great job. I mean, you're talking about the first episode of Nitro, and I'm going to grade this really highly. I'm actually going to give it an A. You're talking about the first episode of Nitro, and you need to make a really big splash. You start the show with Jushin Thunder Liger and Flying Brian Pillman. They put on an epic match. You have your big coup with Luger, and you're ending with the world champion defending his title. And that world champion just happens to be potentially the most important wrestler in wrestling history with Hulk Hogan. The fact that he's working with Big Bubba, which obviously WWF fans know is Big Boss Man, it works really well for this match. It's phenomenal for this match because they already have a natural chemistry. They know each other. They know how to work with each other. Yeah, obviously Hogan's going to go over here. He's not going to drop the title to Big Bubba, who's really kind of a mid-carder at this point. I do think that there's a moment where there's a boot to the head that is hilarious, and I laughed out loud when that happened. Hogan wins on a leg drop, and that's what you want to see. Whether you're a fan in the stands or whether you're tuning in for the first time, this will obviously become a formula that gets tiresome. It already is, to your point. But for the first episode of Nitro, I think this does exactly what it needs to do. It gets an A for me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, obviously from a booking perspective, you had to book a match like this, right? This Hogan is your guy. And even if he's getting maybe tiresome in the minds of devout wrestling fans, that's not necessarily who your market is, right? You're trying to get everybody. You're trying to bring everybody in. And Hogan is a household name. Everybody knows Hulk Hogan. Even if you don't know anything about wrestling, you know who Hulk Hogan is. I thought you're right. It was a safe Hogan match. I don't see a problem with it. I do think what was interesting is the fact that the championship, the world championship title was up and on the line on a Monday night show. You never knew what was going to happen. You had to tune in because the championship could change hands on just a regular Monday night. You got to watch every week because you never know what's going to happen. It didn't change hands. Knowing what we know now, it's kind of obvious that it wasn't going to change hands. But to people tuning in 1995, I don't think that was necessarily the conclusion in people's minds. I wouldn't give it an A. I'd give it a B because I am kind of getting tired of Hogan at this point. But I still thought it was a good match. I thought it was, from a booking perspective, I thought it was a very wise decision. So I'm not really going to fault him for that. But as far as the match goes, B, maybe even a B plus, but I just wouldn't go so far as an A. The match ends though. Dungeon of Doom attacks Hogan. This is the first of many times we'll see Dungeon of Doom over the next several months and even a year or so. Lex Luger runs in. He and Hogan clear the Dungeon of Doom out. They back into each other. They turn around. It looks like they're about ready to fight. Macho Man, Sting, and Jimmy Hart run in the ring. becomes a big pull apart. We go to commercial. In the commercial, we have a promo for Fall Brawl to benefit the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and on an unusually subdued Macho Man in that that promo.
It's so subdued that it's almost hilarious, and they really are talking about an important subject. I don't know if they do that for pay-per-views again, but I do know that actually is important to Macho Man. This is something he regularly would advocate for. He actually was a huge charitable guy. He would be in a lot of charities. When Make-A-Wish would happen, stuff like that, he would do things like that. I'm pretty sure on the Make-A-Wish thing, but I do know that this particular thing was important to him.
That Macho Man, stand-up guy. And then after that, I guess it is noteworthy that the vignette for Fall Brawl contains Vader. We'll get to that next week, but I just thought I'd mention it in this podcast that it does include Vader. And then we're back, and then we're back from the commercial break. We've got Luger and Hogan nose to nose. What'd you think about this?
This is another one that I'm torn on. I think one of the problems with going back and watching these is you're watching a lot of things through the lens of 2023. So you really do have to take a lot of the knowledge that we maybe have today and remove it or understand it on a different level. There's Dungeon of Doom being in here is essentially Kevin Sullivan is the head booker and he's the leader of Dungeon of Doom. And unless I'm mistaken, he's booking them to the moon. I mean, just constantly having them in main events and stuff. I cannot stand Dungeon of Doom. I think they're not interesting, even remotely. I do think they progress a story, so I'm not going to be too harsh on them for that. But I think that they're just not entertaining. I think all of them have dumb gimmicks. I think Kamala shows up in this one, right?
He does, yes.
And Kamala, to be fair, has always kind of been that character. So there's, I'm not going to, crap on him. I think Kamala's fine. I do like the paranoia angle. That part I do like a lot. This is something that they're kind of dipping their toes into. I don't know if this was calculated because the paranoia is going to become a huge thing in WCW in about a year. But at this point, it's really kind of the first time that we're seeing this. And we're seeing this paranoia of this idea that Luger is now there. And interestingly enough, he wants a title shot while they just got attacked by Dungeon of Doom. And you have, Sting, who is his boy. They're friends. Then everybody kind of knows that. You got Macho, who is at least on screen Hogan's boy, and they're friends. And Macho doesn't really trust what Luger's up to, and Hogan doesn't trust what Luger's up to. And you got Sting trying to vouch for him. From that perspective, I really like it. But the Dungeon of Doom thing really, really kills me. There's a moment when Hogan asks Luger why he's backyard, and then there's another kind of shitting on WWF thing that I'm just not overly fond of. But at some point, Luger says that he's here for the only heavyweight championship in wrestling, and he's sick and tired of playing with kids. I'm here to play with the big boys. That's a weird one because on the one hand, I don't like it, but this is where the big boys play is their tagline. So it does unfortunately seamlessly transition. In fact, I would say this is one of Luger's better promos that we're going to see from him. So overall, with some of the positives and the negatives, I'm going to give this kind of a B-. I think it's fine, but they're teetering on the edge of this could get really bad or it could be great.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it was an exceptionally good promo as far as Luger goes. I don't mind the Luger cuts on WWF so much. I think they're obvious, but they're kind of subtle at the same time. He's tired of playing with kids. He wants to play with the big boys play. I think that works because, like you said, it is the slogan of WCW. I'm going to allow it. As for Dungeon of Doom, you know that I'm also not a fan of Dungeon of Doom. Eric Bischoff himself is on record of not being a real fan of Dungeon of Doom, and he kind of describes it as this rogues gallery of wrestlers that Hogan felt safe with. And that's kind of why they exist, as to be safe wrestlers that Hogan can work with, because Hogan's really big on safety and not looking bad, Hulkamania and all that. He understands that he's kind of the top of the card talent and those sorts of things. Take that as you will. I don't know if that's true, but that's the way, at least, and what recently listening to him, the way he described it. Going back though, as I said, I think it was an exceptionally good promo for Luger. did not think it was Hogan's best. In the Nitro book, they talk about Guy Evans talks about this promo a little bit, and apparently there was a bit of a disagreement actually during the commercial break. And I'll just read that excerpt. He says, as the commercials rolled on TNT, however, the in-ring face-off almost got real. A relaxed Luger broke character as the cameras turn away, smiling at WCW's biggest star in a moment of satisfied tranquility. Wipe that grin off your face or I'll knock it off, threatened the Hulkster through gritted teeth. You're stealing money from me and my family right now. So we didn't see that. I thought the promo was kind of notable for how hostile Hogan was, that he just cuts off Lex during it. Well, I thought Lex was actually doing a really good promo. Hogan just cuts him off. And at first, and we've talked about it, I kind of thought it was just Hogan being Hogan, right? I'm not going to let this guy get over on me. But now that I've read that, it sounds like Hogan was actually just kind of pissed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still Hogan being Hogan, right? I mean, look, right now we're speculating, and I think that's important to note, but it goes along with a lot of the rumors and innuendo that surround Hulk Hogan. And, you're what'd you say? Wipe that grin off. You're stealing money from me or something like that.
Yeah.
No, he's not. You have a great contract that is already paid. This has nothing to do with you. In fact, this would make you more money from merch sales if you guys do this correctly. I think he's trying to intimidate him. I think he's, again, speculation. You're right. Hogan does a bad job in this promo, and Luger really does a great job. He mentions, you and I have wrestled in all the same places, wrestled the same people, and now I'm here to challenge you because I've done everything you've done, and now I just need to beat you. That's great. And I don't think Hogan knows how to bounce from that, because it's a great, compelling argument, and it's not the same old shtick that you might get, but from, a heel or a face. Hogan is a face, and Luger, it's kind of undecided. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? We've just seen him as a good guy on Raw. Now, is he a good guy here? So it's something that I don't think Hogan is comfortable with, and I think it shows.
And I guess, beyond that, I think the setup is really amazing too, that you're going to see Lex Luger and Hulk Hogan go up for the championship next week, Monday Night Nitro. That's a pay-per-view match. I think that's kind of a wild way to finish the night.
I agree.
So, but that does finish the night. Beyond that, we have kind of the quick wrap up. The gang does all their hyping for Nitro and Fall Brawl and all that kind of stuff. Probably the most important thing in that wrap up, though, and I know you know where I'm going with this. We get the first glimpse of Mongo's dog, and he's wearing a devil costume.
Yeah, I actually have a note here that says, before we sign off, Mongo has his Pepe McMichael in a devil outfit, and all of Mongo's mistakes are forgiven.
Yeah. And I have to say, when we first started watching this, I don't think we were super keen on that dog. And you'll learn along with us if you listen to this podcast that we absolutely fell in love with that dog. And I think it shows now, which I do not think was the case when we first started, but that dog just became loved in our hearts.
Especially when and we'll get to the costumes go with the theme of whatever's happening that night. I mean, that dog gets over quick.
It's a beautiful thing. Well, with that, I guess let's give why don't you give your final rating? I'll give my final rating, and then I'll tell everyone what the Nielsen rating was.
All right. If I was to give this a final rating, I'm honestly going to be kind of an optimist on this one. I'm going to give it a free pass. It's running unopposed, so that's really kind of the only thing you have. I'm giving the show an A. It does exactly what it needs to do. It's a banger first show. Even with some of the negatives that we talked about, the show is an iconic first episode. I've watched this first episode now. I watched it by myself quite a few years ago when you and I started running through these and watching these all together. I watched it in order to prepare for this. I watched it to take notes, and then I watched it again the other day to make sure I kind of knew what was going on. I've loved it every single time. Every single time it feels iconic when going through it. So it gets an A from me.
Well, I'm going to give it a 3.98 star. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to give it an A too. I think I can say it better than the way you said it. I think, obviously it ran unopposed. We can't compare it to what's going on in WWF. So they kind of get a pass on this, but it's what they needed to do. I think the thing from start to finish is what they needed to do to put WWF on notice. that this is something that they need to be concerned about and that they're going to do some fun stuff. And I'm excited to watch more. The Nielsen rating for it was 2.9, which is actually pretty good. They were very, and I know reading the book, they were very pleased with the rating. Obviously, once again, they didn't go head to head, so they had nothing to compare it to. And obviously, probably some WWF loyalists were tuning in to watch this night unopposed and then immediately go back to WWF. But it was a good showing. They were very optimistic and very pleased with how this went.
So that being said, I think that'll do it for us. This has been the Monday Night War podcast. I've been Joseph Rojas and my good friend Scott Kaufman. We'll see you later.
Bye, everybody.
Hey everybody, it's Joseph. Did you like this podcast? Well, we hope that you did, and also that you join us every Monday for new episodes. You can listen to us on Spotify, and soon we'll explore other platforms to bring you episodes of the Monday Night Wars. Did you listen to this podcast and think, pretty sure they're wrong about that? Well, let us know. You can email us at mnwpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's mnwpodcast@gmail.com. And correct anything we messed up. Don't worry, you won't bruise our egos. You can also give us suggestions, follow the show, or even just reach out to us on the following platforms. On Twitter, you can reach us at MON Night Wars Pod. Again, MON Night Wars Pod. And on Instagram and Facebook, you can reach us at Monday Night Wars Podcast. And finally, if you feel like supporting this podcast and also getting bonus content, you can follow us on Patreon at Monday Night Wars Podcast. For the low price of $2 a month, you get every episode of the Monday Night Wars and also every breakdown of every WCW and WWF pay-per-view during this era, with more content to come. Again, and one last time, thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. We'll see you next Monday back here on the Monday Night Wars podcast. So I'm gonna go ahead and mute, and you just lead us in, man.
Hey everybody, it's me, Sket.
Your ass.